Ghost Story for Christmas, Times Wraiths. Part 1. Mr. Dickens receives some visitors. He must have been asleep. That's what he thought. He felt groggy, as if he had drunk too much gin punch. Not that he had. A glass of pale ale at lunchtime and a plate of beef, after which he had come back to the office in Wellington Street. There had been a few things to do before closing up for Christmas. Christmas Eve. It was time he went home. Time? What time was it? Dark outside, but that might mean it was only 3 o'clock, of course. It had not been light all day, and it had been foggy when he came in. Fog coming down, a blanket smelling of sulphur, covering the streets, looping round the gaslights, slinking around doorways, gathering at windows like dirty lace curtains. He looked up and at the window. For a moment he was sure there was a face gazing at him. Scrooge, damn the fellow, always looming up at Christmas. The ghost of Christmas past. He walked to the window and looked out at the fog. The face had gone, but the fog was very dense. Nature brewing on a large scale. Tiredness, that's what it was, and a cold in the head that produced heat, fever, and feeling in every joint like a stiff Dutch doll. Time. It could have been midnight. It was so dark out, and quiet. Unnaturally so, as if the room were full of silence. Come to think of it, so was the office. Had they all gone and left him, here, on Christmas Eve? Harry Wills, the sub-editor, would have come in, surely. Feeling for his pocket watch, he became aware of the darkness in the room. The gas jets were very low, emitting a faint blue light, and the fire was almost out. What on earth? A sound, just faint, as of old leaves rustling, or the lowest of whispers, or the sound of a ghost breathing through a keyhole. Someone was on the stairs. Someone who did not want to be heard. He turned back to the window. There was a grin there, just a mouth, smiling, a grim smile. Humbug! He sneezed. It was gone. He shook his head. He went over to one of the gas lamps to turn up the light. He turned, but the light remained the same, faint blue and cold. Corpse light, he thought, shivering. Another rustle. He remained absolutely still, clenching his teeth, not daring to breathe. He'd have liked to reach for his stick, but he didn't dare. Nothing else as a weapon. A goose quill would hardly do, but it might stab an intruder with the sharp end. He reached out, but just then the door knob rattled. He watched it turn. With a little creak, the door opened. Needs oil, he thought irrelevantly. The door opened wider. There was a figure there, a woman. He knew that because she was backlit by the gaslight in the corridor. He waited. She came in with a lantern in her hand. She raised it so that he could see her face. And, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he said, "Nancy?" For it was she. He recognised her red gown and straw bonnet, the very bonnet Fagin had given her to cover her yellow curl papers when she went out to look for Oliver Twist. And he recognised the marks on her face where Sykes had clubbed her with his pistol. Nancy put her finger to her lips, hushing him. Behind him, he heard another door opening. The cupboard door. A finger, as of ice, touched his neck. "Not Bill?" His voice trembled a little. Nancy shook her head. but she stared behind him to where he knew the cupboard door was opening. He closed his eyes. He felt something clammy, like the breath of fog, steal over his cheek, writhe itself round his neck and touch his hands. The touch of a corpse. Without looking, he knew who it was. His eyes opened to two red eyes. Uriah Heep, not smiling. He never could. Heap writhed a little further off. Water dripped somewhere. The room seemed colder, much colder. He looked down. The water was rising to just below his chest, but it didn't touch him. The water had a ghastly smile, Quilp's smile. The window opened, and the fog came in and made itself into an old man, Ebenezer Scrooge. Fog came in at the open door. Two shapes hovered there, spectacles glinting. Mr. Pickwick. Something like a large egg, Mr. Micawber's head. Surely they weren't all coming. He hadn't enough glasses. Mad, he thought. I'm going mad. What now? He looked at Micawber. Old friend, he wanted to say, but the words froze on his lips. Two more from nowhere. He could smell burning. Part 2. A murder is announced. Charles Dickens surveyed his guests. Ghosts? Guests? No, not guests. Visitors? Visitants? Visitors, then. The uninvited. He had not invited them, and he rather wished they'd stayed away. He looked at them, and they looked back at him, speculation in their eyes. Nancy, with her bruised face, bruises that seemed more livid now. Heap, the colour of lead, with his shadowless eyes and cadaverous face. Quilp's black eyes glittered in his monstrous head. Old Scrooge, still with that pointed nose and thin lips. Cold came from him again. I thought I'd warmed him up, Dickens thought. Mr. Pickwick looked unusually severe. And Micawber, the rest of him had arrived, as had his stick with its pair of rusty tassels. Perhaps I do have a friend there. Jonas Chuzzlewit, something contorted in his face, like a man who had taken poison. And something there by the fire, something made of cobwebs and dust, the ghost of a ghost. Miss Havisham, watchful and brooding. They were real and not real. There was nothing much ghostly about them, nothing so lurid as phosphorescence about them. He remembered Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. No spectral clanking in the cellar had announced them, more's the pity. He could have gone out before they... Well, they hadn't come in exactly. That was it. You knew that they were not flesh and blood. True, 4 had come in through doors, but Scrooge had come in through the window, opened it like an ordinary man, but outside he'd been standing on air. Else how could he have come in at the window of an upstairs room? And Quilp, made out of water, like a dark stain. The others had, well, not been there, and then had been there, here, that is. And it wasn't just that. There was something insubstantial about the whole lot. Not that you could see through them, more a sense that they were not fully in this world. The way, for example, that Mr. Pickwick's feet didn't touch the ground. He could see Micawber seem to rest his hands on the back of a chair, but his hands didn't actually touch the wood. The way Heap's long, skeleton fingers seemed to rub together, but never actually touched. And Miss Havisham, she did look like a ghost. She always had. Not real. Well, of course they were not. False creations proceeding from a heat-oppressed brain. It was hot. He'd thought so before. I'm ill, he thought. Overworked. You don't believe in us. This was Mr. Pickwick. His face exhibited the sternness with which he had repudiated the idea of paying even a penny into the pockets of Dodson and Fogg. I don't! Dickens was discomposed to hear his voice, rather too high. I don't, he repeated. An undigested bit of beef. Humbug, eh? Scrooge croaked. It might have been a laugh. That's rich, Jonas snarled. Coming from you. You made us. But what do you... You mean, my boy... This was Mr. Micawber, his voice sounding exactly as if he were speaking to David Copperfield. How have our peregrinations in eternity brought us here? In short, what are we doing here? I thought you were in Australia. And Maddie thought, how could he be in Australia? Not that, dear boy. You know that cannot be. Mr. Micawber smiled. There was that suggestion of ghostliness again. The smile seemed to hover in the air. We're here because, in short... You did for me, Jonas again, savage. You hated me, Heap's croaking whisper, malice, insolence and hatred in his face. You did for me too. Even Nancy looked daggers at him. It was Bill. It was Sykes. Did a dog really bark? No one else seemed to have heard it. I think you'll find it was you. Quilp was sarcastic. I gave you immortality. You didn't ask if we wanted it, observed Pickwick. You didn't ask if I wanted to be spurned, mocked, hated. I know, Mr. Dickens, the inimitable self. You thought only of yourself. Heap made a ghastly, should that be ghostly, writhe from the waist upwards like a soul in torment. Perhaps that's what he was. Well, look, Heap, none of us likes you very much either. Jonas laughed. Heap writhed like an eel. Oh, I don't care. I've nothing to complain of me. In eternity, with my second Mrs. Quilp, little cherry-cheeked, red-lipped Nelly. What a nice kiss. A leer hovered in the air, and two lips smacked. Dickens felt sick. It's not true. It wasn't meant to. You foul dog! Dickens wanted to leap forward, to seize the dwarf and throttle him, but his arm was like leg. A dog that can bite, eh? Well, why don't you come and bite me? Why don't you come and tear me to pieces, you coward? Quilp shook himself in a very dog-like manner. You fiend! You imp of Satan! Who made me? Who made me? You made me! Quilp's legs executed a demon dance in exultation. He broke my heart. Break his. Miss Havisham. He looked at her. It was as if he could see through her now to the glow of the fire behind her. Don't stand there, he wanted to tell her. A living death. Her voice was cold. He shivered. What have I done? That I should think of that. Poor Nancy, whose murder I have relished in 100 reenactments. And Heap, that slimy, subterranean creature. Jonas, the murderer, with his poisoned face. And Quilp, malignant thing of darkness, I must acknowledge mine, worst of all. The deformed, the demented, the despicable. He felt a horror at himself. But we haven't come to torment you, dear boy. Mr. Micawber looked apologetic. You've done that, thought Dickens, but forbore to say so. Nor to borrow money. Pecuniary embarrassments are no longer you ours. Typical Jonas, in it for the money. No, not money. You think you know all about me. You think you own us? Not now, you don't. Oh, not own. Atonement. Scrooge's rusty voice came in. It's hell, this perpetual cheerfulness. I'd like to be miserable again once in a while. But you made me a better man one Christmas Eve. It's your turn now. Pickwick's voice was grave. Hear me. Our time is nearly gone. A woman is to be murdered tonight. Part 3. A question is asked. Nothing in the room had altered, not even time. Time, Dickens understood then, had stood still. He hadn't known that it could. The faces still looked at him, their eyes unblinking, though Mr. Pickwick's spectacles glinted in the eerie blue light. Eyes that looked right through him, into his heart. That hadn't stopped. I'm not dead then, he thought, only terrified. They see through me. They know me. Guilt flooded him. It was as if his blood burned. A woman is to be murdered, a woman like me. But you can stop it this Christmas Eve. Nancy spoke. And a child. You must save them. You're to go to Bow Street. Pickwick made the statement as if there were to be no contradiction. Inspector Bucket, I suppose. Dickens attempted a laugh, which emerged as a squeak, but no one saw the joke, or if they did, it was obviously not very funny. Superintendent Jones, continued Mr. Pickwick, as if Dickens hadn't spoken, and Constable Rogers. But the superintendent isn't at Bow Street now. He's at Scotland Yard, and Rogers is... You'll find them both at Bow Street, just as they always were. Time had gone backwards then. He would be stepping into the past, though whether this was the present now, or some future into which he had dreamed himself, he had no idea. I'm not, how can I? Take the swiveller, eh? Quilp screeched. His legs, though now turned the wrong way round, danced their dreadful jig, hideous to behold. Ever so humble, ain't we? You've ate the humble pie now. Tasty, ain't it? Jeered Heap. Enough, said Pickwick. He could be inflexible, and even Quilp subsided. Something in Pickwick checked him. The time is drawing near. We need his answer. They looked at him again, all of them, implacable, unrelenting. Dickens pulled himself together. Courage. Persevere. He must have said the words aloud, for Mr. Pickwick, who looked less severe now, said, Good. Where? Crown Street. Not the stationer's, not Molly Spoon, not Alf. Alf Rogers and Molly Spoon had married years ago and had a good many children. Dickens was very fond of them. No, next to the stationer's shop is a little passage, crooked alley. You know it? It was a statement, not a question. I do. His voice came out stronger. Heap and Quilp shrank back a bit. Down there you will find a huddle of poor dwellings and a cobbler's shop. Go past the shop and you will find some steps, down which you and your companions must go. These will take you into a little court known as Hope's End, where there was once a burial ground. I know it. Hope's End Court had been built on the old burying ground. It was one of those underground places, stinking like a cesspit, yet home to mothers and children. Once, when he'd been down there in the silence of the night, he had thought about the dead interred beneath the wretched houses and sheds and stables. Perhaps, in those old days, the dead had risen to a more hopeful future, but there had seemed no hope for the miserable denizens of the present day. Hope's End. Hope's End, let it not be so. I will not. You will go then? Dickens looked at Miss Havisham, at Heap, at Quilp, and last of all, at Nancy. She nodded. He nodded. That was all. 8 ghostly hands pointed to the open door, in through which came a misty vapour which might, he thought, turn itself into the genie from Aladdin's lamp. He wouldn't have been surprised. It didn't. The vapour wound itself into a footman, without feet, oddly. Like a dream, ain't it? Dombey's footman glided down the stairs, on his knees. Dickens followed, on his feet, not that he could see them. The front door was open. The misty vapour mingled with the fog, which gusted in as if a wind had got up. Mr. Snagsby's popular ghost, Guster, perhaps. Part 4. Ghost Walk. Outside, the air was perfectly still. The world had stopped. The fog was so thick that it was like facing a blank wall. He stood on the step, uncertain, feeling the fog envelop him. He would have taken a deep breath, but for the fog. He'd choked to death. A thought came to him. He could go home. No, you couldn't. There was no one there, just a ripple in the fog. Another of them, mind readers, shape shifters, wafting wraiths, taking advantage, and it was ingratitude, sharper than a serpent's tooth. He was angry suddenly and took a step forward, found himself stumbling, reaching for the wall to steady himself. Oopsie! A voice sniggered. Trabb's boy. Don't know you! Dickens flung back at him, too late. The snigger had wafted away. How many more of 'em? As many as it takes, my dear. Another voice, seeming from someone who was standing, hovering by his ear, someone whose voice was a low whisper like the sea retreating from a gravelly shore. He took a step forward. The fog wrapped round him like a shroud, damp as the grave and as dark. An object hovered beneath his nose, an ingenious little model of a patent coffin, Sowerberry's snuff-box. He thought it amusing when he wrote it. A coffin? Mine? He could have wept. He was cold, tired and ill, mad probably, and frightened now, trapped and suffocating. He turned and twisted this way and that like a madman in a straitjacket. It was as if he were being crushed. It was hard to breathe, even to think. My mind is going blind. You must. A soft voice, not severe, not unkind. Go on, cheerily. The whisper faded. Go on cheerily. Some spirit from Household Words, then. But those had been his own words. Perhaps the whisperer was himself, the ghost of himself. Better take notice, then. Go on, then. Perhaps not cheerily, but go on. Yet he didn't move. Murder? Could it be true? Mr. Pickwick had seemed so certain. He had felt it. But now, out here... But suppose he could prevent a murder. He might escape from this, might get back to, well, home and Christmas. Go on, then. Go on. But which way? Left or right? He took one step, then another, feeling his way. He touched the wall, stumbled again, felt a door frame, then a railing. He took another step, stretching his right hand out, straight to keep his balance. Like a blind man, clinging to walls, door frames, railings, he fumbled forward. His right hand touched something, soft cloth. A face, well, a somewhat swollen nose came at him, followed by a moist, turned-up eye. They came separately, then arranged themselves into a face. A furled umbrella rose, unattached to anything, as if to strike. He shrank back against a wall. The face came closer, wavering like a drunken moon. There was the smell of gin. "Oh, Mrs. Gamp! Gamp by name and Gamp by nature. Yes, I know and I knows that you've given me no reason to wish to know anything about you. A little villain, I calls you, a Bragian little traitor. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I apologise most profoundly, Mrs. Gamp, but you must help me. I seem to be lost, I beg you." Mrs. Gamp sniffed. "I hope I knows what my duties is. All in a tremble you are, I sees that. Compose yourself, Mr. Biographer. You'll be wanting to go to Bow Street." The umbrella, like a ghostly arrow, pointed in the direction she was going. "This way." Did everyone know what he was about? Some dark conspiracy? He made to follow, but Mrs. Gamp was gone, her bulky shape making a fleeting hole in the wall of fog, which began to close again. Perhaps he could get through. But no, the hole was sealed up as fast as a tomb. Something touched his face, something which had a trailing string and floated upwards. He made to grasp it, but it was gone. He went on, trying to see where his feet were going. Somewhere a clock struck a muffled hour, and then another. He stopped to listen. Another clock sounded. He lost count. Time gone awry. The time is out of joint. His foot touched something. He couldn't see what. The thing moved, unfolded itself into human shape, and a face looked up, a face topped by the remnants of a ragged fur cap that looked as though it had been chewed. Joe, the crossing sweeper, very muddy, very hoarse, very ragged. "Nobody's crossing." Well, they wouldn't, thought Dickens, not in this fog. But another face, true, with no body, seemed to come from what he thought must be the road. A yellow face with gaunt eyes, ragged black hair and ragged beard. Nemo. Joe was right. Nobody had come and gone. "They dies more than they lives, according to what I sees," said Joe, looking away from Dickens at the misty, fast-filling space where the head had been. "Joe, do you know—" "Don't know nothing." "Bow Street. I need to get to Bow Street. It's urgent, Joe." If only he knew what time it was, what year it was. Was it still Christmas Eve? "Murder." The word came out of his mouth and seemed to hang there in the fog. The fur cap rose up again, and the face followed. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Dickens. Could have said. I don't know nothing, but I knows about Bow Street. I can take you there. Police you wants. Tell 'em, though. Tell 'em I'm a-moving on." "I will, Joe. Only show me the way, I beg you." He thought to give the boy £0.50, or 2, or 3, or 4, as Mr. Snagsby had done. But what use would it be? Joe was... He didn't know what Joe was now. And now he nearly wasn't there. Joe was moving forward with a kind of hovering slouch. But just as he was about to disappear into the fog, he turned round. "Are you coming, then?" Dickens followed, holding his hands out in front of him as if to part a pair of stage curtains, and marvelling at Joe's apparent disregard of the fog, kept as close as he could. Joe walked slowly, turning now and again to make sure that Dickens followed. Odd how silent the city was. The fog, he supposed. There were no footsteps but his own. Joe made no sound. Occasionally, a faint light passed them, showing for a moment like a yellow eye in the dark. Perhaps they were eyes, for no hands held lanterns. Joe stopped before a wall of fog, and, as if a door in the wall had opened, Dickens could see beyond, into the darkness. He stepped forward, as if into a lighted room. He turned round, but the door had closed, and Joe was gone. Part 5. Down to Hope's End. It was Bow Street at last, and there was the police station. There was Superintendent Jones, looking just as he had all those years ago, and coming after him, Constable Rogers, as Mr. Pickwick had said, in his constable's uniform, his red face smiling at Dickens, as if he, too, were unchanged, as if time had gone backwards, and they were young again. "Charles, what brings you here on Christmas Eve?" "Murder, Sam. I heard, no matter how, that a murder is to take place." "Where?" "Back of Crown Street, Crooked Alley, place called Hope's End." "I know it," said Rogers. "Proper den of thieves." "No time to be lost. We have to be quick." Sam looked at him. "You sure?" "Trust me, Sam, I'm sure." And he was. All the doubts were dissolved. Nothing mattered except to get there in time. Sam saw something in his eyes. Something true. "Right," he said. "Let's be off." They hurried through the familiar streets, all alight for Christmas, past the baked potato sellers, the chestnut sellers, the oyster sellers, the stalls where hot meat pies were piled up with gravy, dripping from them, and heaps of puddings smoked in the cold air, past the poulterer's shop, with a peacock in the window, and where game of every kind, pheasant, grouse, wildfowl, pigeons, hung in feathered tiers from the doorposts, past the grocer's, where the windows gleamed with piles of fruit and dates and prunes and preserves in pots. It was all real, no doubt about that. The very air smelt of Christmas, and he could hear music, a group of brass players somewhere. They crossed Long Acre and passed swiftly up Crown Street. From Crooked Alley they could hear the low growl of an angry crowd. Dickens caught sight of a wide-eyed Molly Spoon. The crowd surged towards the steps which led down to Hope's End. Rogers was running ahead, whirling his rattle. Dickens saw him going down the steps, Sam following. He pushed his way through and saw that the crowd, roaring now, was gathered outside a wretched hovel. Catcalls and jeers rose into a frenzy. Rogers and Sam forced a way through the seething mass. The rattles sounded high and urgent, and Rogers cried out, "Police, get back!" Dickens squeezed through the narrow channel, forced by the two policemen, arriving just as Rogers kicked the door in and pushed into the house. Sam after him, and Dickens shoved forward by as many of the shouting mob as could fit. Two women had got in before him. A brawny, black-haired man had a girl by the throat. Blood streamed from her nose. The man's arm was raised as if to strike again with his pistol. "Sykes!" Rogers flung himself forward. One of the women shouted, "Ned Blake! I'm your mother and I'll stop you!" Dickens felt weak at the knees. At his mother's words, Ned Blake dropped the girl. Then his arm flew out, and the pistol caught Rogers on the chin. Rogers staggered back into Sam. Ned Blake ran, barging out of a door at the back, snatching a bundle as he went. Rogers and Sam were up and after him. "See to the girl!" shouted Sam. They could hear the sound of footsteps thundering up the stairs. Another police rattle sounded in the alley, and there was more shouting. "Murder! Murder being done in there!" The people in the room were pushed forward. "Get back! Get back! Let them have room!" Dickens shouted. The two women knelt at the girl's side. "She's alive!" one of the women cried out. Dickens ran out. A back door hung from its hinges. Perhaps Sam had gone that way. Dickens sprang up the stairs and into a small room where a window frame gaped. He looked out. Rogers was about to leap off a low roof shed in pursuit. Blake must have gone through the window. but there was no sign of him or Sam. He went back down the stairs and out into a narrow alley where, impossibly, fog hung down and enveloped him again. There was silence too. He stood still, but he had no idea where he was. The murderer had vanished as well as Sam and Alf Rogers. But he had done what his visitors had asked of him. The murder was prevented. He could go back and tell them. But they'd know already. Perhaps they'd be gone. He stopped. A sense of horror gripped him. The child. Nancy had said to save the child. He hadn't even thought about it. And the murderer had snatched a bundle of something as he ran out. It could have been. There was nowhere to turn. The alley had neither beginning nor end. The house was gone. He stood. Surely one of them would come to guide him back. Where was Joe? Even Trabb's boy would be welcome. But no kind spirit came. No ghost of Christmas past, or present, or future. There was only the fog, and he, lost and chilled to the bone. But they'd be there somewhere, their eyes accusing, not satisfied, and he, forever the haunted man, or the haunting man, he didn't know. The end of it. He must have been asleep. That's what he thought. He felt groggy, as if he had drunk too much gin punch. Not that he had. A glass of pale ale at lunchtime and a plate of beef, after which he'd come back to the office in Wellington Street. There'd been a few things to do before closing up for Christmas. Christmas Eve. It was time he went home. Time. What time was it? That dream. It came back to him. Horrible. But they weren't still here, were they? Stepped out of the dream to haunt him still because he had failed them. Just a dream, surely. He looked up. The room was light, the gas jets flaring, and a good fire burning, and a sparkle everywhere, as if a household fairy had been in and polished the place. I hope not. Outside the window, stars prickled. Charles? Superintendent Sam Jones was there, substantial, real, smiling, and not as young as he was. Dickens looked at him. He looks ill, thought Sam, or at least exhausted, working too hard. He ought to be at home on Christmas Eve. You're asleep. Are you all right? Were it not that I have had bad dreams. Sorry, Sam, just tired. What brings you here? On my way home. I've been to Bow Street. Bow Street? What for? Hearing the anxiety in his voice, Sam was puzzled. What was Charles so afraid of? Not committed a crime, have you? He smiled, but Dickens didn't. He looked paler than ever. I don't no, not as I know of. I went to see Alf Rogers, but he wasn't there, so I went to the shop to wish them, the compliments of the season, and thought to come to do the same for you. It's Christmas Eve. Still? Yes, it is, so it is. He looked at his watch. Christmas Eve. How are they all? Thriving, though they had a tale to tell. Apparently, there was an attempted murder in one of those alleys behind the shop. Attempted? Something hoarse in his voice. What on earth was wrong? Oh, well, some brute of a man tried to murder his girl. Molly Spoon heard the racket and sent for a policeman, Alf being on duty. And they came double quick. Molly was surprised, must have been nearby. The queer thing is, Molly thought she saw Alf. Alf Rogers? Yes, our Alf. But in his constable's uniform, just as he was all those years ago. A young man. A young Alf. As a constable. He forced himself to respond. How strange. Wishful thinking, Alf said when she told him. He was at Bow Street. Molly saw two others, not clearly. Plain clothes, I suppose. You weren't. There? What's the matter? Sam thought. He must be ill. Oh, no, of course you weren't. Addle-brained I am. Overwork. Sorry, what else? Well, the girl was saved, and her child. A child? What happened to the child? Well, there was a baby in a drawer for a cradle. The girl had partly shut the drawer when she heard the man banging on the door. Couldn't stop him getting in. Good job the police were so quick. He'd have done for her otherwise. Well, when Alf and the Bow Street lot got there, it was all over. Alf's trying to find out who the other lot were. Went after the brute, I should think. Dickens smiled. Sam thought he looked better. The colour had come back into his face. All's well that ends well, eh? He noticed a shining decanter and glasses for the first time. There was a plate of gingerbread too, and oddly, a bottle of pale ale. What about a brandy, to toast the coming of Christmas? They drank, and were warmed by the brandy, the fire, and each other's company. Oh, I forgot to say, there was a lad outside, sitting on the doorstep. One of your waifs and strays, I thought. He reminded me of who? Well, your Joe in Bleak House. You know, the crossing sweeper. It's what he said. He was very good to me. Dickens looked pale again. Who did he mean? He looked up at your window. I thought he meant you. I hope so. I do hope so. Time to go, Charles. I'll walk with you. They went out into the street. There was no boy on the steps. They stood and looked up to the star-strewn sky. Dickens saw a shape there, a curious, triangular thing, a ghostly kite, a string trailing from it. He caught sight of a bonnet. A voice came from the air above. Mr. Dick sets us right. Aunt Betsy Trotwood. The pale ale. That's what she drank when David Copperfield had worked and worked. Mr. Dick's favourite, gingerbread. It was all right. Things had balanced out. Dickens laughed. Sam turned to him, surprised. You've cheered up. I have indeed. Merry Christmas, Sam. He looked up at the glittering stars. God bless us, every one. The voice of Tiny Tim.